I am a co-founder of an organization affiliated with the School of Education called Challenge Success. And we partner with schools and families and communities to embrace a broad definition of success, one that is not just about test scores and where you get into college, but many, many paths to success. And we implement research-based strategies to promote student well-being, equity, and engagement with learning. And I'll give you a little bit of background on this study. We were asked to partner with NBC to conduct an original study to understand teens' well-being and engagement with learning, particularly during the pandemic. And this was a really nice partnership. And luckily, it was all set up sort of before March 2020 when everything shut down, but it put us in just the right position to use a survey that we've been using for years to then add a few questions and ask questions during the pandemic. So we use the Challenge Success Stanford Survey of Adolescent School Experiences that we've administered to over 250,000 students for years and years and years. For the purpose of this study, what the data that I'm going to share with you today, we looked at 86 high schools, 75,000 student surveys that were a combination from all the way from fall 2018 through 2020, so including fall 2020. Of 9th through 12th grade students, very diverse mix of students by gender, race, ethnicity, and geography. And at times, I'll just pull out just the fall 2020 data. As you know, there was a lot of things going on since March 2020, and it's not just the pandemic. We had a very heated election happening in the fall. We had wildfires, and from today's verdict, we've been spending months and months discussing and talking about a referendum on race that clearly has been its own pandemic for years and years and years. So the survey is looking at students' perceptions of well-being and engagement, and we ask a bunch of questions on a bunch of topics: stress and worry, sleep, their physical health, school belonging and connection, what they're doing outside of school, which changed pretty drastically in 2020 when everything got shut down, their parent expectations, homework, engagement with learning, grading, and academic integrity. And there are three main takeaways that I'm going to go over today. Students, especially female students, are still stressed. They were stressed prior to 2020. They're still stressed and struggling. Their relationships with adults and peers are strong, but appear strained in recent times, and we'll go into some details on that. And engagement with learning, where you're excited about what you're learning, where you enjoy what you're learning, where you see meaningful and purposeful learning happening, which is always a challenge, is really especially low now. So let me walk you through some of these findings. What we asked on this particular slide, what we asked is, compared to the time before the coronavirus impacted your community, to what extent have your experiences in the following areas changed? And you can see meeting my parent guardian's expectations. About half of those stayed the same. Some of those increased stress around that. Pressure to do well in school, about half of them increased, right? Stress related to school, over half said that increased, and worries about college went way up. Now, if we take a little closer look at that and look at some of the subgroups, you can see that particularly females were feeling more stressed than males, and particularly students of color, Black, Hispanic, and Latinx students were feeling more stress than compared to students who identify as white. What we also see are some other measures of stress. One thing that was kind of interesting to us is on a list when students choose sort of what is causing you the most stress and why, 32% of students reported that their mental health was a major source of stress pre-pandemic. And this is different from before the pandemic, where only about a quarter of them were reporting that as one of the top stressors. You can see that 83% reported having at least one stress-related physical health symptom. That means headaches or stomach aches or exhaustion or difficulty falling asleep. This is pretty similar to pre-pandemic levels, particularly what we saw both pre-pandemic and post-March 2020 is that the females were reporting these physical health symptoms more than males. And the thing that was sort of particularly worrisome is only 35% of our sample reported that they're quite or very confident in their ability to cope with stress. And again, that was similar to levels seen before the pandemic, but now we know that they're reporting that the stress is higher. So that was particularly worrisome to us. And you can see that's even lower for females and lower for Latinx students. So key takeaway number 2, students' relationships with adults and peers are strong, but they appear strained in recent times. And what you can see here is sense of belonging at school. Again, this is sort of compared to the time before the coronavirus and everything else happening in March 2020. Sense of belonging at school went down. Strength of relationships with peer went down, and strengths of relationships with teachers went down. So nearly half of the students reported a decrease in sort of how strong they felt the relationships were with their teachers and with their peers. So there were some positive trends in fall 2020. This isn't all bad news. 72% said that they have a trusted adult to go to at a school if they have a problem. So that's really good. You know, we'd like to see that super high, but at least it's over half. But we did see a range. We had schools that only 56% of the kids were reporting that, up to schools that were reporting 82% of the students had an adult to go to, which we know is one of the main things we look for. It's a very common question in suicide prevention, for instance. Do you have a trusted adult you can go to at the school? 87% have another student to go to for a personal problem. Great. We know that that is also can be a protective factor. And this was a pleasant finding that they believe that many of the adults in their school respected diverse identities. And we asked about gender orientation, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, etc., socioeconomic class. So they do feel respected. They do feel they can bring their authentic selves to class, which was a positive trend. You can see we also asked a bunch of qualitative questions. What's going well with remote learning? They liked the flexibility. They liked that teachers were more sympathetic. They liked when teachers stayed on Zoom and offered more help. And that was a trend that we've been seeing with many of the schools that we've been working with. There were, however, some concerning trends. Fewer students from the under-resourced schools that we surveyed reported having a trusted adult to go to at a school. Often, and it's actually not even size, because we saw in some of the smaller schools that were less resourced, this was happening as well. 41% of our sample reported that teachers never check in with students to ask how they're doing. That's pretty troubling. And then this one, 28% report that none of their teachers understand their lives outside of school, particularly when we know that many of these kids were having to take on extra jobs, having to take on extra duties at home, maybe even putting their own classwork aside in order to help with younger siblings or care for someone who was ill. What can your school do to improve? Talk to kids, but not just in groups, right? Talk to us like individually, and give the students a little extra time with assignments and be patient with us. And those were themes that we've seen over and over again as we're working with schools to think about what they want to keep, positive things that happened for the fall. We want to keep this idea of flexibility. We want to keep this idea of connecting with kids. Third takeaway is engagement with learning. And this is always a challenge as an educator. This is sort of probably the most focus that we give, is that we don't want it to be, just busy work, right? Just kind of going through the motions, becoming a robot. You want the light of learning to be up in their eyes. And unfortunately, we've seen some real changes. So effort in school decreased, engagement with learning also decreased, and then time spent on schoolwork, interestingly, that increased. A lot of them felt like they were doing more, but just sort of going through the motions. When we look at engagement, we talk about engagement. We have a concept. It actually comes from the title of my book, which is called Doing School. And doing school basically means that you're doing the work. You're kind of, what we would say behaviorally engaged, but you're not excited about it. You're not finding joy in it. And most importantly, you think it's busy work. You don't see the meaning or the value in it. And so you can see between fall 2019 and fall 2020, doing school really went up, and the number of disengaged students went up as well. So doing school increased to 53%, especially higher for females. Disengaged students increased to 11%. And that was especially higher for males. And, we know huge school populations like the LA Unified School District where kids just completely disappeared. So they didn't even fill out a survey. So imagine what these numbers would be if we had, sort of full participation of kids. To be fair, we did not survey LA Unified. I just want to put that out there so we don't get in trouble for that. I do want to share some parent survey insights as well. So we have at Challenge Success, we have 3 surveys that we can implement. We have the student survey, which you've just heard about. We have a faculty and staff survey, which is tied to the student survey, and we have a parent survey. So these are the parents reporting on what they're worried about for their students. And again, you can see this is from 2018 through fall 2020. So these were their top concerns out of a list of many. Their top concerns is that they're worried that their kids are unhealthy emotionally or physically. And we heard that loud and clear. They're worried about a lack of self-confidence. They're worried that their kids don't have friends. Remember how isolated they have been, and that their kids are unhappy. Interestingly, they also agreed that there were increases in stress about schoolwork and that there was a lot of homework, probably too much homework happening during the pandemic. This is just from fall 2020, but their kids, the student perceptions are actually higher, right? So who's right? You've got to go with what the kids are perceiving because they're the ones who are living it. And if they're the ones that are perceiving that it's stressful, they're the ones that don't feel like they have the coping strategies to deal with it. That's when we get into some of the mental health worries and the physical health worries that we're seeing. This is an interesting way that the slide just went. So we also have asked them about their parental expectations. You saw that on an earlier slide where the kids said that their parent expectations mostly stayed the same. Some got a little bit higher. So 64% of parents say, I set very high expectations for my children. 53% of students say, I often or always meet my parent expectations. One of the things that we know in education research is this ability to meet your parents' expectations is actually a protective factor. It's when you feel like you cannot meet the expectations that have been foisted upon you, that's where we start to see some of the declines in mental health and physical health. Another thing we asked about were sort of parenting rules. And one of the rules that came out loud and clear was this expectation that the child maintain a high GPA. 66% of parents said that. And what was sort of very surprising to us is that stayed the same or even grew with just the fall 2020 parents. So even though we're in the middle of everything going on in this country, 66% of parents are still expecting their kids to maintain a high GPA. And 46% of students have said, my parents want me to be the best at everything. I mean, can any of us be the best at everything? But think about that perception and the kind of stress that puts on a kid. And they're getting that from how their parents are sending messages, right? If the first thing you say when you walk in the door is how'd you do on the history test, right? You're cueing that that's the most important thing that you care about that day. If you ask them about their grades, you're constantly checking grades multiple times a week, and the kids know that, you're sending these messages that you want them to be the best, and it's adding a lot of stress. So that was a super quick highlight of the study. I'm going to do one more slide before we get to Q&A. If you're interested in downloading the study, all the slides that you saw here, with a few exceptions, are written up in a memo, and you can go to this bit.ly and download the study. You can also go to our website, challengesuccess.org, and you'll see a link to get to the study from there as well. So rather than just leave you on with sort of doom and gloom, I do want to say that Challenge Success works with many, many schools across the country and even outside the US to talk about strategies for change to improve some of these very sort of scary and doomy statistics. And we have an acronym called SPACE that is basically based on research around best practices for schools. We have taken this from lots of different places: Linda Darling-Hammond's work, Chicago Consortium of Schools work, best minds around curriculum, etc. And I'm just going to walk you through these 5 categories and give you a sense of some of the things that we do with schools to make positive changes for student mental health and really to increase engagement with learning. So the S is student schedule and use of time. And one of the things that was very clear during the pandemic and remote learning is that people had to shift their schedules around. It didn't make sense for schools to have kids online 8 periods a day, 45 minutes each without a break. It's just too much Zoom time. Well, it turns out that even before the pandemic, we were trying to get schools to change their schedules, make it much more of what we would call a collegiate model, where you're not running around like a chicken with your head cut off all day. You're going to fewer classes, but you're maybe in them for longer so you can go deeper. We're also looking at how much homework they have in schedule, sort of what are they doing after school, how overscheduled are they. It's really hard when you're going to get home at 10 o'clock at night and sit down and start hours and hours of homework. So we're looking at sort of the whole picture of student schedule. Is there enough time to transition? Is particularly during the pandemic, was there enough time to like take a break, go run around outside, have lunch? The P is project and problem-based learning. We know from lots of research that we shouldn't be learning in the way that we used to many, many, many years ago, where your teacher stands at the front of the class and gives a lecture and you take notes and you fill in worksheets and then you kind of spit back information on tests and quizzes. We know that that is not as effective as really giving them authentic, very relevant projects to work on, where students have what we call voice and choice over what they're learning and how they learn it. And we hear from kids that that makes it much more relevant and exciting. When during the coronavirus, when teachers made the learning related to what was happening, where kids were actually tracking statistics and seeing what the numbers were in their communities as they were learning some of the math skills, looking at the science behind how a virus spreads, right? These are things that are, it brings learning to life, and it really helps to engage students. So when you have the schedule that works with engagement, you have project-based learning that works to up your engagement. We have to assess kids in a way that makes sense. Many, many schools in the pandemic were asking us and saying, how do we give tests? How do we give quizzes? How do we know what the kids are doing? We can't see what they're doing at home. They might be cheating. They might be going on the internet and looking up answers. They might have mom or dad feeding them answers. And this gave us sort of an opportunity for us to say, you know what, you probably shouldn't be doing that kind of assessment on a regular basis anyway. Guess what? There was a lot of cheating happening before the pandemic. In our surveys, we measured cheating and we were at about 80%. This is pre-March 2020. So again, we sort of use this as an opportunity to get schools to think differently about assessment. Think about how you're assessed in real life, how your boss determines whether a project is good or whether you've established mastery over something that you're working on. Your boss doesn't give you a timed test, doesn't tell you that she's going to come in tomorrow and you don't know what you're going to be assessed on, and doesn't make it sort of a one-shot high stakes deal. So we work with schools to really change assessment and change grades. And that's another thing that happened. Actually, if you remember, in spring 2020, many schools went to sort of a credit, no credit model or a do no harm model because they knew that everything was up in the air. Well, pretty much right back in fall, schools went back to that old model of grading, and we're trying to get them out of that and really look at more models around revision and redemption. The C is climate of care, and that's probably the most important thing. And I think you can see from our research that if you don't feel like you belong, if you don't feel like you are respected, if you don't feel like you can bring your authentic identity with you every day to school and be known, then you're not going to learn. So belonging correlates with engagement, belonging correlates with well-being, and fear of being left out, fear of not belonging actually gets in the way of learning as well. So we were thrilled to see the good data from this study that showed that teachers really were making an effort to connect with kids, to reach out, to see how they're doing. Again, we had that 40 some odd percent who felt like their teachers never reached out to them. But most of the kids appreciated that. They appreciated that teachers were around for office hours. Many schools created sort of small group advisories. We know that has a huge impact, and also started to focus more on social emotional learning and positive coping strategies. So one of the things that we hear from educators is this may be a very resilient group of kids that comes out of the pandemic. And I think in part because so many of us are working to get educators to focus on that, even above the importance of the academic content. And then the E is sort of this catch-all, educate the whole community around the developmental needs of kids. And those of you who have heard me talk before know that there's certain very important things that correlate with mental health, one of which is sleep. And we were hoping with the pandemic, with lack of commute and all of that, that maybe kids were getting more sleep. Turns out there wasn't much difference in sleep when we looked at our study. I think because anxiety, I think because social media use, et cetera, went up, that this was keeping kids awake longer. But we do work with schools to do late starts, and we work with parents to really think about the importance of sleep and the importance of family time and playtime. So we have a mnemonic aid PDF, playtime, downtime, family time. And you're going to remember PDF every day. Every kid needs PDF every day in order to sort of work against some of these things that we're finding in our study around stress and mental health and worry, fear, anxiety, depression. We know from research that allowing kids to have play, that means little kids, letting them, build the forts in your house, and they're doing a lot of science. They're doing a lot of social emotional learning when they're playing with others. Big kids, play is very social, right? Let that teenage boy, talk to his friends while he's gaming for a little bit, because that is how he's not going to be so isolated as we get through this pandemic. So you want playtime every day. You want downtime, including sleep and the ability to, get exercise and practice coping strategies. And you want family time. And I know, like, especially now, I think we're all kind of like, okay, our kids are going back to school finally in little tiny bits and pieces. And you see like a very happy memes out there of adults saying, yay, we're happy because we need our space. We're happy because we want them to be back in school with their friends. But it turns out that family time is actually a protective factor, intentional family time. And I think a lot of us appreciated the slowdown of not having extracurriculars and allowing us to have dinner as a family and see our kids more and have conversations and do things together. Family service is connected to academic achievement, and just having fun together as a family, it turns out is a very protective factor. So remembering space for best practices for schools, remembering PDF for best practices for parents. And we have plenty more where this comes from. So if you're interested in learning more, we have our website. You can text kids to 38470 to be a part of get our newsletter on a monthly basis. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. We are here to offer whatever we can. And with that, I think we have some time for Q&A.
So Denise, we actually got a lot of questions as we kind of think about the multiple pandemics that we are facing over the past year and quite so for a lifetime, especially when we think about a racial pandemic that's going that we've been facing. We also have experienced an uptick in violence and violent attacks against members of the Asian American community, which also lends itself to questions about Asian American students and some of the stresses that they're feeling as well. A number of our guests also noted perhaps a lack of specific call outs of information around the Asian American student experience. And I was wondering if you could just spend a couple of minutes addressing any observations or trends that we're seeing specifically with our Asian and Asian American students.
Good, yeah, and I apologize for that. So the call outs around the Latinx students and particularly the students who identify as Black were because we saw this pattern that looked very different from what we saw, and for females from what we tend to see. So there was either much higher disengagement or much higher stress. For Asian American students, and we do track Asian American, again, it's how students self-identify. We see high levels of stress. We see it's very similar to what you see for the sort of majority of students, that stress goes up. We see doing school. We see, which is, remember, that's sort of not really enjoying or being interested in the information, but just sort of going through, becoming sort of what they call themselves robo students. And there's no doubt now we delivered these surveys in the fall. I think that Asian American, more of what we've seen sort of around crimes against Asian Americans, et cetera. I mean, they've always been there, but sort of really coming through happened, of course, because they were calling the coronavirus the China virus and all of that. But the real violence started, I think, after we had surveyed most of the students. It would be interesting as we resurvey schools to see if that has changed and gone up even more.
Absolutely. I'd love to ask a question that we received earlier through the registration process, we received a question about addressing mental health issues, but kind of thinking about how to new approaches or best approaches to address mental health issues for students who self-identify with not needing the help, or students who typically don't seek it out or are reticent to do so.
Yeah, that's a tough one, right? So as a parent, one of the things that became very clear is when kids are not physically in school during the day, some of the protective factors, teachers who have eyes on kids, counselors who have eyes on kids, you can kind of see when a kid isn't acting sort of the norm. Much more since remote learning, we've relied on parents to tell us they had to look for signs, to be the eyes and ears that we can't necessarily see because we're not seeing the kids on a daily basis. And some of those signs are something that you might not recognize as a parent, which is, if the grades are suddenly going way down and kind of stay down, if your kid doesn't feel like getting out of bed, not just like once or twice in the morning, but if this persists over, 10 to 14 days, if they just have no desire to do the things that once made them happy. Now, all of these things in a pandemic, we've all experienced a little bit, but if you see something that is sort of persisting, I had a mom email me yesterday saying her daughter's grades just went way down. She has no desire to get them up. This usually is someone who's pretty engaged in learning, and she has just no energy to do homework, and she's very lethargic. That's a sign that you need to reach out to a mental health provider, whether or not your child wants you to. And I think that's the point of this question, is that when you're an adolescent, you can't necessarily see when you're in crisis or where you're kind of heading, towards that crisis. You as a parent have to trust your gut and say, this is my job as your mom. We're going to call the pediatrician, or we're going to check in with the school counselor, because what I'm seeing, I'm very worried about, and bring them into that. It may be a huge relief to them that you see this and you don't have to come, they didn't have to come to you and say, I'm worried about this.
Thank you. That was great. So Denise, I'm going to take a left turn back into the report. And you are in the company of your fellow alumni, your fellow amazing alumni who can interrogate and investigate a report and really read through it. And I was just wondering if you could comment on some of the limitations of the report. I'd love for you to maybe comment on what a partnership with NBC News allowed you to do, and maybe things that were limiting through the process as well, and kind of understanding what the student experience during the pandemic looked like.
That's a great question from alum researchers. So we go through IRB, right, the Institutional Review Board at the university. So there's some things that we're just not allowed to ask. We are not allowed to ask about suicide ideation. We're not allowed to ask about drug use. We're not allowed to ask about stimulant use. So on the one hand, there's some limitations that, NBC might have wanted us to look at suicide ideation. That was off the table from the beginning. The other thing is that all of this is de-identified. So we can't identify a particular student. It's anonymous and confidential. We can, if a student writes something in qualitative, when we're doing the qualitative research that makes us worry about them as an individual, we can kind of try to figure out maybe, who or where that student is so that we can get that student help. But everything is student report. So we're basing this on them and them being sort of honest. And what we found over the years and doing focus groups and whatnot is they are pretty honest because it is anonymous. A lot of people think, oh, they're exaggerating their stress levels or they're exaggerating their homework hours. Turns out that doesn't happen that much when we actually have other ways to triangulate the data. So that's some of the limitations, right? That we can't dig down at this particular student level. We also, and this is important, we look at some under-resourced schools, but we do not look at student SES. So we can't tell you which individual students are low income or whatnot. We can only look at sort of the school profile of that. So that's another limitation. What NBC afforded us is they allowed us with some money to bring in more schools that would normally not either be interested or be able to afford to take this survey. So that was a real win for us. And they then went, and even though we had qualitative data in our survey, and we had a lot of it, they went out and put names and faces so they could go out in their stories and interview individuals and talk to them as individuals. So there was one student who said, my Latina student said, my mom had saved for college for me, and pretty much all of it that we were saving had to go to rent. And so, it was this very sad story of this kid with college aspirations, but because of the pandemic, it sort of had taken that away. And as a result of that story from, I can't remember if it was the Today Show or one of those, people started a GoFundMe page for that kid and raise money for her to go to college. So I feel like, when you do put a name and a face, the stories are very poignant, and also we're helping those individual kids as well.
I see a question here from Devin. It was clear that 72% of students were comfortable seeking input from a trusted adult within the school. Is it clear what position that adult held, and could that tell us about what that student to adult engagement really looked like?
So what's interesting on our study is we actually have them break down. So once they answer that question, is there any adult at the school who you feel comfortable going to with a problem? Then we ask them, to sort of check off all that apply. Is this a teacher? Is this a counselor? Is this the principal? Is this a support staff? Is this a coach, right? And we see almost all of those checked off. I should say the principal probably gets a little bit checked off a little bit less, but the principal doesn't know the kids as well. And every once in a while, we do have people check off that they would go to the principal.
Right. I see another question that came in. And it is, what do you believe accounts for some of the discrepancies in stress levels and engagement between female and male students?
That's a really good question. So one of the things, and we've talked about a lot of reasons, and I will say right now, this is all sort of speculation. And it's from maybe pulling together when we do some of the qualitative as well. If you think about some of the things during the coronavirus that had to happen, we had people having to take over childcare or cooking or home duties because parents had to keep going to work, and they had to take care of siblings who were not in school. They had to help the siblings get onto a computer if there was a computer at home, or find the Wi-Fi, in their community. And those tend to be, they shouldn't be, but those tend to be female oriented chores. So in certain families, it was put upon the girls to do this. Another thing that we know, and we knew this before the pandemic, is that more girls tend to be pleasers. More girls tend to be wanting to do a good job, get the grade, be able to sort of handle it all, right? We grow into women who then feel the same way, right? And so you see, as we saw throughout all of 2020, women trying to juggle all these things. Unfair to say more so than men, but that's what we saw the trends. Again, I don't have the data on that. This is speculation. The other thing is, the last thing that we know is the kinds of questions that we ask about stress and worry tend to be not as many males self-identify this way. So a male is less likely to say that they're stressed than a female, even though the male and the female might be experiencing the same level of stress. So it's a male trend that they don't report on those ways, or they don't experience what we would call internalizing symptoms versus externalizing symptoms. So when more males experience externalizing symptoms, they're angry, they want to lash out, that's a reaction. And our questions tend to be more about internalizing symptoms.
All right, I'm seeing a question here from Ian. In thinking about stress related to conventional expectations of success, which stakeholder group do you perceive to be most well positioned to create change? Students, parents, high schools, colleges? Why? And how do you push that group to act?
Ian, awesome question. So all of Challenge Success is designed around this notion that it's going to take all of those stakeholders to really make a difference. And I'm going to give you an example. We primarily work with schools, and just because it's easier to get into a school and change some of the policies and practices than to get into everybody's home and ask them to change their practices, although we absolutely try to get parents on board as well. When a school does something like change the homework policy and they forget or don't do a good job of sort of bringing parents along and getting their voices on board, you may have what happened at a school that we work with, where the homework policy was changed and it looked like it was going to be much better for kids. And parents took that time, that valuable time that was freed up, and just started to give their own extra workbook or worksheets. So unless you bring everybody into the picture, and here's where we will primarily say you must listen to the students first. So we are about transforming the student experience. They're the ones who know it best. So on our student survey, we ask them, what would you do differently? You're the ones living this, and they'll say things like, well, that schedule doesn't work because we can't get through the lunch line in that time. Or the teachers, or you have a no homework weekend. That's great. All the teachers just assign more homework due on Tuesday. So you need all those stakeholders to be a part of it. And I will give one little nod to colleges, because I know that this is a stressor. The colleges will say that they feel sort of powerless. Like, what can we do? It's out of our hands. K-12 education is out of our hands. However, what we did see this year is many colleges, including Stanford, did not require the ACT or the SAT, mostly because kids literally could not take it. And that had a huge impact on student stress levels and on sort of the time that they spend. So every kid who would normally be, cramming and tutoring and trying to figure out how to pay for and all this stuff, multiple tests, that was sort of taken off the table. And we saw more students of color and more students from under-resourced schools applying to some of the more selective schools who in the past would have required them to take those tests. So I do think that all the stakeholders, colleges included, have a role to play in making changes here.
I'm going to take a left turn back into the report. We have a question from Sarah. Do you have a breakdown by gender for the percentage of students who felt they had a peer to talk to about personal problems? Is that lower or changing for boys versus girls?
That is a good question that I don't know. We do. So the answer is yes, we have a breakdown, but that I don't have in my notes. I wonder if Kari has it to put it in the chat. Yeah, I don't even want to venture a guess because I don't know that, but it's a great question. We'll get back to you on that.
We received a lot of questions, particularly before the event, about college admissions being so competitive and kind of building up the confidence and kind of thinking about the mindset of going to college and how that's kind of been shook to its core, so to speak, over the year. And so when we're thinking about our students who are venturing into college this fall, or our juniors who are becoming seniors who are going through the college admissions process, what are some things that they should keep in mind, especially given the circumstances of the past year?
Good. Well, okay. So one thing is most of these schools, I would venture to say anyone who went test optional last year is going to continue that. I'm seeing them come through as in pieces. But my guess is you will have that same very large number of colleges saying the same thing, that it's test optional. So if you are someone who is if your kid is someone who is not a great test taker, or you don't want to you want to just take that off because they've got enough on their plate right now, this upcoming year, and many have adopted a 3 to 5 year plan for that, will be similar. So just take that off the table because, and save your money, save all that tutoring money and whatnot. And for those students who maybe never even knew about the SAT or ACT, or it was never on the table, I think use this as an opportunity that you now have some doors open to you that were closed before the pandemic. So that's one thing. It is absolutely harder for these kids whose extracurriculars shut down last year, who are very busy and like to put this on their Common App, right? All of the extracurricular activities that they do. And I want you to know that all the colleges understand this. They understand what happened to your grades in the beginning of 2020. They understand that you might not be back up in full swing with your sport or your music or your drama or your grades this year. And they're taking that very much into account. So you have to do the best that you can do while remembering to stay healthy. And parents who have these really just unfairly high expectations of their kids and the GPA that we should be at the same level that we were pre-pandemic, that's not taking into account what really, we know is best for kids, which is you love them unconditionally, you have high expectations, but you're there to support them. You certainly don't expect them to be perfect in everything. So anyway, that's I think and the other thing is you might not be able to visit those schools, but there's a lot going on the internet. So you can have an info session, you can have a tour, all of these things virtually now, and schools aren't asking you to show demonstrated interest by visiting. So I think on the one hand, it's made it a little bit scarier to deal with the college admissions. On the other hand, there's a lot of things that are better for kids and really sort of making things better for kids. And of course, community colleges take everybody, and in many states they are completely free, and it's a great option, particularly if your circumstances have changed during COVID. It's a great option for kids, and in many states they are the first to allow to look at transfers. So if you want to get into the University of California and you don't think you have the grades, or they don't count test scores anymore to get in, you might want to start at community college. That you will be in that first batch of kids that they look at then to then get accepted to the UCs.
Denise, so our lovely colleague Kari kind of commented on this within the chat as well, but I kind of wanted to just give you a moment to chat with our audience about that, because we had a few folks, several folks actually, in the Q&A who had really strong feelings about the lack of Asian American students being mentioned or specifically examined within the report. And I just wanted to give you a moment to maybe chat about that. You know, as someone who also identifies as part of the Asian American community, that is definitely something that I think of when I look at research and reports, and I wanted to just give you an opportunity to share some feedback and comments and how you're thinking about the communities that you report on with your work at Challenge Success.
And I appreciate that, and we appreciate the feedback. We have a lot of Asian American students who identify as Asian American in our survey. Of all of this sort of different ethnicities that we surveyed, that's probably the second biggest, right after white. So we have a lot of data on Asian American students, and we have a lot of data on Asian American stress. What we do know, and again, this is a conglomeration of a lot of different research, not just our own research, is that in some Asian American communities, the academic pressure on kids is really, really high from parents who did not grow up in the US and who think of sort of like the SAT or the ACT as this equivalent to the test maybe in their own country, which is much more high stakes and decides if you're going to be like a day laborer or you're going to actually be working in a company, you know, when you get out of college. And so we do a lot of work. We actually have much of our materials are translated into Mandarin or written Chinese, including many of our workshops. There also tends to be, and again, I don't want to overgeneralize, but a stigma associated with mental health in some Asian American households, where you don't talk about this, where you sort of you handle the stress because you're strong, you meet your parents' expectations no matter what, right? Don't let the family down, don't make us proud, don't shame us. And so we also have been working with the Department of Psychiatry at Stanford, and there's actually Rona Hu has developed these sort of skits, these parent and kid communication skits of how and it's done in Mandarin, how parents and kids can communicate with each other about issues that are really, really different if you didn't grow up in this country and you don't know that, you know, getting into Harvard is not the same thing as like getting into ITT or something like that. So it's really educating Asian American parents who may feel like they don't know enough about sort of the American college system or the way grades work. It's very, very different in some of these schools. So I hope that helps. So I feel bad that we don't, I think the reason we didn't call them out in this report is because we always study Asian American kids, particularly pre-pandemic. It will be very interesting to see the mental health, particularly for the Asian American students, as we start to survey now that, you know, it's been very clear to see the racism, incidents of violence, et cetera, go up even further.
Absolutely. And I just wanted to echo that. Our colleague Carrie at Challenge Success did offer to provide any breakdown of findings in case folks want to, learn more and kind of disaggregate that information accordingly so we can get that included. And I think, we only do better with the feedback that we receive. And so I think the feedback that you're providing completely contextualizes the type of work that needs to be done in the conversations that can kind of continue to evolve here. So thanks for that feedback and thank you all for putting that into context for all of us. I wanted to ask you a question. We've got a few of these about holding students accountable, especially as they're headed back to in-person learning or staged experiences in hybrid learning as well too. Are there specific things that we as parents or educators or district leaders need to think about in terms of providing measures of accountability to what our students are doing?
That's a good question. You're sort of after, as a parent, the sort of Goldilocks, just the right fit, right? I think many of us, when the pandemic happened, myself included, I have 3 kids, kind of said, you know what, let's just get through this. Like, don't worry about grades. Don't worry about that history paper. Like, it's much more important that you take care of your health, that you stay connected to the adults and the friends in your life, that we as a family are going to kind of get through this together. And I think a lot of our rules changed around social media, maybe getting your homework done, maybe how much sleep. And I think we're going to start to try and get back into some of those really protective rules around media use, around sleep, around family time, around playtime, without going back to the crazy, overscheduled, high, unrealistic expectations, college mania that was pre-pandemic. So I think there might be a lack of accountability that happened last spring for people who were like, let's just get through this. I mean, it's just like, Eggos for dinner. And if you get the homework done, it's a bonus. To now, where we do have some expectations, we want to hold kids and let them know that learning is important. We want to be respectful to teachers and try to get the homework done. But at the same time, to really communicate if it's just out of whack. Right? You saw so many parents who thought that there's just too much homework. We always see kids thinking that there's too much homework, but even that went up. And by the way, our homework hours at the high school level was around 3. It's around 3 hours a night. So that's like doing a whole other shift, right? You're in school, extracurriculars are starting to come back. You got about 3 hours a night of homework. Again, that's our average. There are definitely kids who are doing more and definitely kids who are doing less. But finding that sort of balance around accountability, I think, is the most important, and having that conversation with your kid.
Got a question from Mercedes. What is your assessment on the effect of the pandemic on the development of social intelligence? Should schools do something next academic year to address social development delays?
I've been hearing this a lot with like younger parents of kids who have been really isolated, who maybe from pre-K or kindergarten or first grade, all that time where you're learning really how to interact with others, how to not, like hit the kid in the sandbox and that kind of stuff. And there's a big worry there. And then again, sort of middle school, high school kids, some of them have been kind of happy that they haven't had to deal with the social drama of school, right? Who to sit next to in the lunchroom. How do you handle cliques? How do you handle, mean girls, etc. So I think one of the things that we've said all along, even before the pandemic, and we will continue to beat this drum very loudly, is the importance of social emotional learning. That one of the most important roles of schools is to work on how do we treat people, ethically, fairly? How do we communicate our needs? How do we listen? What does it mean to be a good friend? What does it mean to be a good citizen? Right. And so these go all the way from sort of don't hit the person in line, when you're waiting to get into the lunchroom, to voting rights and how we respond to this, this trial today. Right. It's all the way there. So we know that it's connected to academic achievement. So this focus on social is incredibly important, and it's only going to be better for your kids, both socially and academically.
All right. And so my last question to you, Denise, before we wrap up and say farewell to everyone is, what's the silver lining? What are we learning from this report, the experience that we have from this report in the past year that we've been kind of thinking about what pressure for our students actually means and ways that we may want to persist to alleviate that pressure moving forward?
I think people get mad at me when I say silver linings because there's been so much bad about this pandemic. But if anything good comes out of it, I think there's a few things. Schools absolutely now understand the importance of social emotional learning and teachers connecting with kids. It might have been something that was done sort of automatically with not a lot of thought because you're there with the kids during the day, but boy, when they went online and there was a screen between you, many adults realized just how much of that sort of natural interaction was missing and the importance of focusing on it. I think many schools realized that the past schedule and the homework load and all of that, like if you took a step back, you can't possibly teach everything, right? In remote learning that you were teaching before. So they're really focusing on what is important, what is the big picture here, and how can we get that. That's what we wanted them to do before the pandemic. We wanted them to reimagine schedules and assessment and climate of care, right? So I feel like we have more understanding of what goes on in school. We have more understanding about the importance of school, that school is daycare, that school is a food provider, that school is a social provider for our kids, not just academics. We have colleges that have made a huge, I can't tell you how huge that change is around SAT and ACT. And the University of California abolished it. I mean, it's huge, right? So that's a huge silver lining that I think we're going to see benefits from to come. And I mean, just speaking personally, I think we see more resilience from kids. We see more independence. They really stepped up in times where we needed them to. Kids have taken on extra jobs. They've taken on chores and roles that we didn't think they could handle. A 7-year-old can handle getting on Zoom, by themselves. They know where to go, right? Things that you wouldn't have done as a family, maybe more family time and family dinner. So I think there's a lot of good to come out of this. The trick is going to be, can we keep it going? Can we remember these things? Can we not go back to the old normal? And can we all please thank our children for getting through this time and show gratitude and show how proud you are of them, and how proud as a family for really getting through this, because hope is definitely on the horizon.